In this section of the chapter on the integumentary system, we're going to look at the structure of the skin, the layers that make it up. The skin is also known as the cutaneous membrane and is made up of two major layers of tissue. There's an epithelial layer, which we call the epidermis, and a connective tissue layer, which we call the dermis. So we want to look at more closely what makes up the structures within these layers of the skin. This figure shows the different layers of the skin, of which there really are only two. The bracket at the top highlights the epidermis, and the bracket below that represents the dermis, the two layers of the skin. There's a third bracket here for the hypodermis, which is not really a layer of the skin. The word hypodermis essentially means below the skin, and so it's outside of that organ properly, but it gets included in this chapter for a couple of reasons. One, it's very important to some of the functions of the skin, especially the body temperature regulation aspects, because when blood is in or below the hypodermis, it's insulated by the subcutaneous fat. Also, there are some structures in the skin which are normally in the dermis, but in the thinner parts of the skin can be found actually in the very superficial regions of the hypodermis, like hair follicles and some of the deeper sensory structures. The epidermis is further subdivided into its own layers, the specific layers containing particular cell types. Starting at the most deep layer and working up towards the apical surface of the epithelium, the layers are the stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and stratum corneum. The stratum basale, which is really just the basal layer, is made up of those cells right at the edge, right along the interface with the dermis below it. Most of those cells are a particular type of cell that will see through all layers of the epidermis, called a keratinocyte, or keratinocyte if you prefer to pronounce it that way. In the basal layer, the keratinocytes undergo mitotic division. They'll divide there. One of the resulting cells will be pushed up into a higher level, the next level of cells, and therefore push older cells higher and higher up into the various layers of the epidermis. The other cell will remain in the basal layer as a stem cell that can undergo further mitosis to increase the number of cells in the epidermis. The stratum basale also has two important types of cells that serve other functions. There's the melanocyte, which is responsible for producing the pigment that gives skin its particular tone, and there are Merkel cells, which are responsible for helping the sensory endings in the dermis interpret a certain aspect of touch stimuli. The next layer up is called the stratum spinosum. In this picture they show that it contains keratinocytes, as we would expect, as all layers do. What's not represented in this picture, however, is that another type of cell called the dendritic cell, or some sources will call it the cell of Langerhans, is also found in the stratum spinosum region. And that's the immunological cell that I mentioned in the function section. Then we have the stratum granulosum, which is a layer that has grainy inclusions, granules, whatever you want to call them. That's where the name granulosum comes from. That is a signal that those cells are breaking down and clearing out their organelles. These cells are at a point where they're just at the edge of getting nutrients from the underlying blood supply in the dermis and being able to clear waste products out. They're essentially the end of the living cells in the epidermis. Beyond the stratum granulosum, all of the cells that we're talking about here will be dead. And the next two layers are the stratum lucidum and the stratum corneum. Stratum lucidum is referring to a layer that often appears light under the microscope. Light shines through it to some degree. And then the stratum corneum is the outermost layer. Not all skin has a stratum lucidum. all skin does have a stratum corneum, but only the thicker regions of skin have a stratum lucidum, and we'll talk about that in a little while. The keratinocytes that are found in all the different layers here are named for the fact that they have keratin as an intermediate filament of their cytoskeleton. When we get up to the dead cells in the stratum corneum especially, those are basically just empty cells except for all of this keratin in them, which helps to hold them together to form this physical barrier of dead cells that can't really be harmed any further than the fact that they're already dead, and it helps to provide some of that physical protection to the epidermis. This is a list of the 4 major types of cells found in the epidermis. Melanocytes and Merkel cells are found in the stratum basale. The keratinocytes are found in all layers, stratum basale through stratum corneum, and dendritic cells are found in the stratum spinosum, along with keratinocytes. This is comparing a couple of pictures showing 2 different fibrous proteins. The one on the bottom is collagen and the one on the top is keratin. The point of these 2 pictures is to show the common sort of configuration of proteins that are fibrous in nature, which is that they tend to be coiled strands of protein. In the case of collagen here, it's 3 strands that are braided around each other, and in this case of keratin, it's 2 strands. Now, these 2 pictures have been especially colored to just highlight the different strands of protein in there. So we see a yellow, purple, and green strand in collagen and just a yellow and green strand in keratin. They are, however, made from very precise information about the structure of these proteins. And each of the little circles or globes that we see in any of these represents a particular atom. Could be a carbon atom or an oxygen atom or a nitrogen atom or sulfur or something like that. They are all relatively similar sized atoms, so for the most part it doesn't matter which one it specifically is, it's just an atom in that place. These 2 pictures are not represented to scale. The individual atoms that we see in collagen are much bigger than the individual atoms we see in keratin here. So if you imagine shrinking the collagen fiber down a bit, you could see their relative size. The difference in appearance here is really just how the amino acids are arranged with each other and curled around each other. So keratin is just a much thicker fibrous protein than collagen. I'm comparing it to collagen here just because collagen is a fibrous protein that you're familiar with from looking at connective tissues and is going to be a big player also in the dermis. These 2 micrographs represent 2 types of skin, and this is in reference to what the epidermis looks like. The top panel, A, is what we would call thin skin, and this micrograph is probably of the scalp, which is the thinnest skin we have. And then B is what we call thick skin, which is, again, probably from somewhere like the sole of the foot or the palm of the hand, which is where we have the thickest skin. The major difference between these 2 is the presence or absence of a stratum lucidum. Now, thick skin is thick, like the sole of your foot, because it needs to have a lot more protective layers of cells there for walking around in bare feet or something like that. We also see it on the palms of our hands, because really those 2 regions, as far as the skin is concerned, are analogous. We don't walk around on all 4s, but if you consider an animal that does, like a cat or a dog, their foot pads are pretty similar on the front and the back as far as the skin that covers them. For humans who walk only on their feet, the hands still have thick skin because it's still useful. It provides a nice surface that can create friction with tools or whatever that we might be holding on to. And thin skin, like we see in the skull, is fortified, so to speak, by hair follicles that are in it or something like that. Another place where we see thin skin is right around the edge of the lips, sort of where you would put lip liner on if you were putting on makeup. You might have had the experience after eating spicy food that particular area burns a little bit more than others, and that's because the active ingredient in spicy food, called capsaicin, can get through the skin easier there and activate more pain fibers. The dermis also has layers, only 2, and it's really a matter of the different types of tissue that make it up. The papillary layer is areolar connective tissue that's immediately adjacent to the stratified squamous epithelium and provides a rich blood supply to that stratified epithelium. And the reticular layer is pretty much dense, irregular connective tissue. Now, the papillary layer is called the papillary layer because it has these little bumps of tissue, which is what papilla basically means. Those bumps of tissue kind of fit in with extensions down of the stratum basale, and it all fits together almost like Velcro. Not that you can pull it apart like Velcro, but there's a very intimate interaction between the two layers of tissue. And those interactions actually lead to the structure, lead to the patterns that we see on the surface of the skin, the lines in the skin, like the fingerprints and that sort of thing. The reticular layer is called the reticular layer because the word reticular means network, and it's made up of a network of collagen fibers. Now be careful, don't get confused. It's a reticular layer of tissue. It's not reticular tissue. It's dense, irregular connective tissue. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. Of the 4 types of cells that are found in the epidermis, the keratinocyte is the one that's found in all layers. New keratinocytes are born in the stratum basale through mitosis, and then the new cells are pushed up into the stratum spinosum, and eventually newer and newer cells keep pushing cells up into higher and higher levels, where eventually they'll be sort of compacted down to thin layered cells, giving us the stratified squamous type of epithelium.